record on this computer. Here we go. Hey, welcome to the hot potato problematic pandemic people stuff problems. Oh, it always gets me every time with a little tongue twister. This is the second webcast in the series, and we are talking about sour grapes. Don't let it turn to and vinegar. I can't say that word because last time I put it in an email, all my emails bounced. So anyway, we want to make sure that we don't turn something nice into something bad. In our first webcast, we talked about bad apples and what turns people into these negative grumble bums that can have a corrosive effect on the culture of the place. We looked at how to counteract that by becoming biochemical drug dealers. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the bad characters or the sour grapes that can emerge from some of the dynamics that we run in our organizations. So plenty of amazing things to talk about. Thank you for those of you who sent through answers to the prep questions. There's a lot of tough stuff going on for leaders when it comes to dealing with people problems. And I was just saying to Linda before we got started that what I'm hearing a lot and seeing a lot with teams is that where there were problems before the pandemic, they've kind of risen to the surface and become more evident and obvious as we go through the pandemic. So if people had performance issues beforehand, they're still there and getting worse because of the distance of supervision in many cases. If there were tensions before, they're getting worse potentially. And if people had a skills gap because they didn't have the skills and ability to do their job, well, that's become even more highlighted as we go through. So yeah, lots to cover. The first thing I want to talk to though, which I think is also important because it forms a backdrop against which leaders are operating, apart from the pandemic, which is its own thing, we have a crisis of trust in leadership. And this has been going on for some time. And if you think we've been lurching from Royal Commission to Royal Commission over the last many years, starting such as, for example, with the Royal Commission into the stolen generations, the Royal Commission into the banking failures, the financial institutions, the Royal Commission into child sex abuse, and the latest one, I believe, there might be some others that I'm not aware of, is into aged care. And for those of us following the pandemic outcomes in Victoria, and every day all the deaths coming in saying it's all attributed to deaths in people in aged care facilities, that's adding more fuel to the fire in terms of holding leaders to account and not really trusting either our institutions or our leaders. And so whether or not you're in that kind of field or not, how we feel and think about leaders is tainted by this crisis of trust. I was reading the Edelman's Trust Barometer report from February of this year, and in particular in the research findings in Australia. And they surveyed, I think it was 34,000 people in Australia, and about trust in public institutions, and it's pretty bad. In fact, in Australia, they rated no institution either as both competent and trustworthy, and ethical, I mean. Not competency or ethicalness, that is totally not a word. Competency and being ethical are rated as two significant factors in trust. No institution in Australia rated high in both. Non-government organizations, NGOs, rated high in ethics, but not in competency, and businesses rated high in competency, but not in ethics. And the two public institutions that rated low on both were media and government. So if you're in media and government, you have a big mountain to climb in terms of gaining people's trust. And so I think this sets the scene of what leaders need to navigate when they're trying to build positive culture. There's this sense of distrust when it comes to considering leaders and how they operate. And it's hard, like leadership is really darn hard. You put yourself on the line, you put your hand up to be accountable and responsible, and then you have to deal with all this stuff, let alone all the guilty by association stuff when it comes to the crisis of trust. So this is what I've been hearing leaders say about what's going on for them when it comes to dealing with tough people. You know, people are tired, they are tired, leaders are tired, they're lonely, like it's a tough gig leading through this pandemic. You have to be brave for the people because you got to front up every day and make decisions in this unknown and do the best that you can without any sort of end point to this whole darn thing. And it's difficult to just get on and do it. And at the other end of it, we're still dealing with this irritating people stuff. These people management issues are problematic. And we just want people to shut up and do their job. Sometimes we just want to say that. Just go and do your darn job. And they don't. And they're bitty. They're bitter. So some of the responses that leaders are having to this are, there's kind of 4 ways people are responding to it. The first one is they're keeping all the issues at arm's length. And in the first 6 weeks of the lockdown, the first lockdown, so I guess that's sort of mid-April, May, a lot of organizations were laying off staff. And this one particular Canberra institution or organization, it's part of a multinational, was dictated, you have to lay off people. So they told their staff via email that by the end of the close of business, 200 people would lose their jobs, and those who were losing their jobs would receive an email between 12 and 6 p.m. And that's how they did it. Total arm's length. Now, I totally get why, as a leader, you might do that, because 200 people to move on is a lot of conversations, and it's a lot of emotional distress to be able to handle. And there's probably an efficacy of just sort of pressing it by and saying, this is what's happening. And so my colleague who is working at this organization, well, he got a text in the middle of it all. And so which said, you're fine, no worries. Meanwhile, if you were one of those other poor buggers waiting between 12 and 6 p.m. to find out if you still had a job, can you imagine the cascade of fear and distress that would cause in the organization? So arm's length is definitely one way that people have been handling this pandemic. Another way is Pollyanna. Pollyanna, I admit, this is me in the initial response to the pandemic. Thought, wow, this could be the thing that unites countries and the world around this common enemy. Never before, not even all the world wars, have we had something that has been pervasive and unifying and common across all countries, all nations across the globe. I thought, this is it. This could be a tipping point into how people interact and relate to each other for the positive future. So I definitely saw a Pollyanna spin on that. And I was wrong about that. And in fact, what's turned out is probably the opposite. So instead of unifying globally people, it has in some extent, it's driven people further apart from a survival point of view. So we've seen increase of factionalism and nationalism and parochialism as a result of the pandemic. So people are really looking after their own little patch. And so you can see this between states and how the states are sticking to their border controls and looking after their people. Like, we're all their people, we're all Australians, but you know, whoever you're responsible for has become your people. And so we have this sort of back off kind of effect happening there. But before that, anyway, we had Pollyanna was one response to the pandemic. The third one was emu, head in the sand. It's like, it's not happening. It's just not happening. In denial, I think, was one constant thing. And the fourth one is leaning in. You know, it's like, well, this is it. This is where we're going. Let's sort it out. So in the chat box, I'd love to hear which one you have been. Might have been all 4 of them or none of them in terms of your response to the pandemic. Have you done the arm's length thing? Have you been Pollyanna, head in the sand, or leaning in? Or something different altogether? So which one have you been? Pop it into the chat box. I'd love to get a sense of how people have been responding to the pandemic. So the options are arm's length, Pollyanna, head in the sand, and leaning in. Okay, let's have a look. Leaning in, leaning in. 2, 3, and 4 at various times. Yep. Ooh, Pollyanna leaning in. Leaning in, but it's super challenging. Yes, it is super challenging. Pollyanna. Initially head in the sand because I just couldn't even imagine how this could evolve, but very quickly started to lean in. Yeah. And these are all really common human responses. to this situation. Nobody has a background in how to handle pandemics unless you're a pandemic specialist, which there are. But even then, not any of them had had this kind of global experience, this kind of experience with this kind of global impact. In pockets, yes. So it's bloody hard. So how do we deal with all of this? I want to share what we do with this. Just going to get the slides up with you, for you. Okay, so these are the trends. So how we respond, apart from leaning in, is this. Is that when we know the patterns, we can manage the people. And we started talking about some of this in our first webcast with bad apples, what causes people distress and what causes them harmony. And we're going to unpack the four devils of people stuff in today's webinar, which is one map that you can use to understand and navigate the challenges of difficult behavior like sour grapes. Systems sour the grapes. I was actually talking to Linda about this right before this session too. We had a great old chat about systems causing a lot of the cultural challenges that we have, of which sour grapes, people who are bitter and resentful, is a symptom of. And it's that's what we need to pay attention to. What are the systems we have in the organization that are creating the distress and disharmony? Because that's often the cure that we want to get to, is getting below the surface of the grumbling to find out what's really causing it and making the changes there. And this is the third observation, is that when you have really strong people skills, it can help smooth the flow of turbulence in the organization. Definitely, if you have the skill and the ability to be empathetic, to be a good listener, to be perceptive, this will go a long way to assist you in being able to help people through the difficult times that we're experiencing. Okay. So we're going to take a deeper dive into this particular principle, which is know the patterns and manage the people. So when I was doing a lot of research for my latest book, I saw this pattern emerge in terms of how people responded to things. They have an inner experience and outer expression of that inner experience. The inner experience consists of an interaction between beliefs and emotions. And people are quite elemental. That's why there's fire, water, air, and earth in this model. So beliefs create emotions and emotions reinforce beliefs. So there's kind of this infinity circle, if you like, between beliefs and emotions. Now, what people do with that, they can either express it verbally or through their behavior, and that becomes the other axis. So the wind is like communication, so speaking, that's your wind, and earth is behavior. Now, when people are calm and there's nothing really turbulent going on, it's a lovely day at the beach. All these kind of elemental factors show up really nicely. It's like you're at the beach, the sun is out, there's a gentle breeze, the water ripples a little bit, and it's just a nice place to be. You know, when people are getting along, that's kind of the equivalent analogy. And yet, if something starts to stir the elements, this is when all hell can break loose. And in the people dynamics, the thing that causes the turbulence starts here: fear of loss. Fear of loss puts us into the primal survival mode that I was talking about. This is what I hadn't figured out when I was in the initial response phase to the pandemic, that people would fear loss as much as they do or did and are still fearing it. And when we have particular fears of loss, it can drive this difficult behavior that we've been calling, some parts are bad apples and some parts are sour grapes. And we'll drill down specifically into sour grapes in just a moment. So when we have a loss of power, a loss of autonomy, for instance, where we're told we have to go into lockdown, we have no choice in the matter, it's legislated, it's not something that we chose for ourselves, our sense of control and autonomy is lost. Now that's sort of in the pandemic phase, or even being told you have to work from home. If people didn't opt into that, there's a sense of loss of control that can happen for folks. In a business context, I'll give you an example. When I worked at Outward Bound many moons ago, It was outdoor experiential education, and I was on the executive, and I was in charge of staff and training. And we had this one room called the planning room, and it was a small closet-like place where we had this big magnetic whiteboard, which was before the time of spreadsheets and computers. Yeah, that's how long ago it was. We would allocate staff to different programs around the country on this planning board. So each staff member had their name, and we got to place them on different programs around the country. Now, given the nature of the work, all of our clients seem to want to come in very concentrated times. So there's peaks sort of around spring and peaks around autumn. Summer, not too hot, winter, too cold. So there was a lot of resource requirement around those two stages. And what happened is that when things got busy, resources got scarce, and inevitably my training team would be taken from their training duties and sent to go out into the field as instructors, which totally makes sense. You know, you need to allocate your resources when you have these peaks and troughs, except they drove me insane because I never had a choice about that. And so I would have these arguments, these turf wars with my colleagues around use of my staff. And that's when you have these kind of experiences. Firebug is when we are angry, we're frustrated, and we articulate that. So I was constantly having arguments with my peers about when and how I could use my staff on their particular programs. Because my staff weren't happy either. They got hired to do training. They didn't get hired to do program delivery. In any case, it caused strife. So whenever we're fighting over resources, it can cause turf wars. Whenever we feel like we don't have control of our resources, it can cause this firebug kind of behavior. On the other side here, when we have an emotional experience and we are expressive for it, we become what I call a storm driver. You know, somebody who rants and raves and all you can feel and experience is their emotion as opposed to their argument. Now, the difference between a firebug and a storm driver is the locus of control, I guess, or the trigger. So the trigger for the storm driver is things that are related to relationships and relativity, not the physics piece, relational activities. So loss of position is about loss of status and and a sense of unfairness happening. And this can trigger really strong emotional responses in folks. So the storm driver can be really, really emotive. When I was working at a different organization, a colleague of mine was a little bit bored in his role. And so he took on a special project to upgrade and update the website. So he's a bit of an IT geek on the side, but his main job was in program facilitation. That was all well and good. He was happy to work on it, except he was really slow and the project was taking forever. So the CEO decided that this couldn't go on. He needed to concentrate on his main job, and this website thing they were going to outsource. Sounds sensible, except that she didn't consult with him. She just told him, said, this is the way it's going to be. You're getting off the website. We're putting it out here. And he just went ballistic. He thought it was so unfair that he wasn't consulted. He felt devastated because he couldn't contribute. So he lost a sense of status with this. And so he became really difficult to talk with about this issue because it was such a sore point for him. He just felt like he was mistreated, I guess. And when people feel like they're mistreated, when they feel hurt and harried, as you do on this side of the model, this is where you get sour grapes. This bitterness and resentment really comes out of this corner here. So when people have fairness and status issues is when things can start to go a little bit bitter and twisted. Down here on this relational side of the model. So the right-hand side of the model is about issues around relationship and human dynamics, if you like. On the left-hand side, the issues are around control. I'll come back and finish off the left-hand quadrant in a second. On this right-hand side, down here, the loss of place, which means loss of sense of belonging in a group, is a significant trigger for people. In fact, there's been plenty of research that says when we feel like we've been excluded from a group, that kind of emotional pain appears in the brain system the same way as physical pain. So if we are left out of something, if we are excluded from something, if we feel like we don't belong, our sense of safety is completely compromised, and we can go into a major survival response to that. And this results in some of the behaviors of the water bomber. Now, the water bomber is similar to the storm driver in that it's an emotional experience. Unlike the storm driver, we don't necessarily feel able to communicate verbally about what's going on. So we have this weird kind of demonstration of disturbance. And these are really difficult to be around. So here's two versions of the water bomber. The first one is the one that walks past you with a wake behind them. We might know them as emotional vampires. The one that I remember experiencing is a colleague who really felt like she'd been excluded from the executive team and was on the out. And she would let us know by stomping up and down the corridor and doing this. It was insane. Like you kind of just cringed a little bit when you heard the stomp, 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 sigh. Like, it's funny now. It was so not funny then, because you're kind of like, oh, you want to stay away from this mess. And we knew it was the story that she was telling herself about what she was going through, but that was her experience. And yet she felt unable to communicate it except for this corridor stomping and deep sighing. The other version of the water bomber is slightly different in that they turn into a clown. So you know something is going on for them, but when you ask them, they say, how are you? Fine. They give you that sort of like cat's bum look. And that's really difficult because you can't actually have a constructive conversation with either of those two because they're so emotionally distressed by what's going on for them. Now, the fourth trigger is the loss of performance. And I've seen this a lot during this COVID times, is that as people have extra responsibilities and duties and problem solving put onto their plate, the ability to perform is compromised because they're feeling overworked. And all of us go to work wanting to feel accomplished to make a contribution. And sometimes when we have extra things put on our plate, we can feel like we're drowning in work. So what tends to happen is a couple of things. We can just end up putting our head down and burying our head in work. So we become even more siloed. It's like, I don't have time for anybody else's problems. I just got to focus on what I've got to do. So as a CEO trying to handle that, that's problematic because you want your executive to be working collaboratively together to problem solve the organization's problems, not just their own little unit. And yet if they feel swamped with what's going on, they're just going to be like, nah, I'm just going to look after my own patch. So silos can be a problem here. And also, if people do not feel safe and able to communicate, which is a little bit of what we talked about in Bad Apples in terms of that lack of oxytocin and trust happening, then they will start to grumble and go around in the back channels by white anting and grumbling and going underground, if you like. And we call these the ground splitter. So these are kind of the issues that we've got that show up in bad behaviors. We've got silos with the ground splitter. We've got turf wars with the firebug. We've got jealousy with the storm driver, and we've got distress with the water bomber. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing that for a moment so we can have a conversation. What I will do is I'm going to pop you into chat rooms for a 10-minute conversation about which of those four devils you've experienced and how have you handled them? And did it work or not? Okay, so that's the question that I'm putting you into the breakout rooms with, is which devils have you experienced? How have you handled it, and did it work or not? Okay, let's see. Oops. Okay. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms now, open all rooms, see if, move you to breakout room 4. let's see. So I've got a few people not yet joined. Susan.
Yeah, I clicked on breakout room 3. It's taken me there.
Okay, let me just see. Where have you gone? I might have to reassign you. Unassigned. Let's see. Where did you go? Huh. How do I, let me just see. Breakout room. I might move you to another one. Breakout room 2. Did you get another notice to move to another breakout room?
Haven't received anything. No.
No. How do I get this to you to move you into another one? Let me see if I can move you to it. I'll try a different room. Because you were showing up in a different, I'll move you to breakout room 4. Nothing?
Nothing.
Oh, I don't know how to troubleshoot this one.
No, I can't help you. Hang on, there's a breakout rooms box here. Does that do anything? Oh, you've been assigned to room 4. Okay, I will try now.
Okay, fabulous.
So loss of purpose, and we were curious as to loss of purpose. Where does that fit in this loss wheel? Because for loss of purpose and loss of people, as in people being that face-to-face energy that you get from other people, or that just being able to chat and offload. So those two were the losses that we felt were sort of the hardest to manage.
We thought they'd been really present for the last 6 months, you know, because of COVID, that we both had experienced them with our teams.
So that last loss of purpose and people interaction would sit on the right-hand side, which is all relational.
Yeah.
So you're going to have emotional responses. So you're going to have storm drivers or water bombers coming into relation as that. Yeah. It's less of a survival trigger in terms of putting people into amygdala hijack, and more just sadness. That one. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so we thought it might have been the loss of place, or that distress, loss of purpose, loss of place, loss of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Nikki.
We didn't actually get to that many good examples, although Susan had a good example, but mine was really just, you know, those people who closing the doors and 40 staff all working from home. It didn't suit some people and it did others, and we opened our doors again in the July, and we just gave people choice. You know, the way that we managed it, people were struggling from home with kids, with flatmates who didn't allow them to work easily in a small flat or whatever it might be. So we just gave people the opportunity to come into the office or stay from home if they needed to. You know, we couldn't have a one-size-fits-all. And that really just helped everybody that was out there. You know, I think the people who were working from home and comfortable working from home and worried about the pandemic and worried about catching it, you know, who might have aged family or whatever it was, we settled them down by going, we're not going to ask you to do anything that you don't want to do at any time, you know, and we're opening the office for those who want it, but those who don't want to go in and really want to stay home, you can stay home, just keep doing what you're doing. So we just approached it with, I think, understanding, transparency, open conversations, and just really trying to make sure that we looked after everybody's interests differently.
That's really good emotional intelligence approach to it, which you'd hope that you'd have, which you do have. And that's really great that people can be flexible like that. Some organizations can't. It's either one or the other. Some people have mandated, I've ran this series in June, and there was one organization that no one's allowed to work from home. And that caused strife as well. And others are like, we don't want to work from home. So it's good that if you have the opportunity to be able to do both. Well, thank you for sharing your experiences. I'm going to share some solutions for us. which is always good news because otherwise it's very depressing. So let's have a look. So some ways to address some of these issues. With the first one, fear of loss of position and status, where you have jealousy, and Nikki sort of modeled that really well, is that instead of telling people what they should or shouldn't do, you ask them what's going on. Ask them what they feel hurt and upset about. So what you don't want to do is tell them how they should feel. I remember when I resigned from one particular organization, and it was a difficult experience. Like, it was after a long, protracted, problematic experience. And this next day, the CEO came up to me and said, "Well, I guess you feel relieved now." And that just irritated me even more. I'm like, no, that is not how I feel. I feel that this was a lose-lose for me, lose for the organization, and that I feel really distressed by that. I don't feel relieved at all. So the last thing you want to do is tell people how they should be thinking, feeling, or doing. And when somebody is experiencing sour grapes, that bitterness, that frustration, that hurtness, the best thing we can do is listen to them. Is to find out as much as we can about what's going on. Ask them what they think is fair. Ask them what their status challenges are. So this is a hard one as a leader, because you'll spend a lot of time listening and not necessarily being able to provide immediate relief to that person's issues and grievances. And yet, when you show that you're interested and that you can listen, that helps significantly. So the second solution is to fix your frameworks. And I alluded to this earlier. So this fear of loss of power and autonomy. So it's control and able to make decisions for yourself, speaks to some of the systems that you might have in place that are causing the sour grapes in the first place, that are causing these turf wars. So when I was at Outward Bound, one of the things we had to fix was our process for planning. As soon as we started to work collectively and collaboratively on staffing allocations, my grumble bum issues disappeared, because all of a sudden I was co-creating the solution with my colleagues instead of being told that my staff were being taken. So some of the systems, and there's 4 that I want to draw your attention to that cause a lot of sour grape issues. The first one is delegation and decision making. It's kind of two systems in one. These are all control systems. So how we delegate work can cause overwork for some, which can cause the ground splitter issues, the silo issues. So how we do delegation is really important, and creating a scene where people can negotiate and discuss what's on their plate and see if it's reasonable or not is really useful. We don't want people to say, yes, 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 I'll take on whatever you give me, because then you have burnout issues, which is not fun either. So delegation frameworks are really important, and decision-making frameworks are also really important. How do decisions get made? There's transparency around that. And if people want to challenge decision, that's really important too. So what are your mechanisms for that? So decision-making and delegation are pretty critical ones to avoid the left-hand side of the model, which is around the control issues. The other 3 systems are largely on the relational side, which are real sour grape ones. Promotion systems. If we don't have a clear process for how people get promoted, if it's just gone ad hoc, if it's done surreptitiously, if it's not transparent, if it's just favoritism, that can cause a big problem for people. So how the organizations runs promotions, if they can run promotions, is pretty critical. Because if those are hidden and not done consistently, that will for sure send people into resentment and sour grapes. The third system is recognition. How do you actually recognize people? So that's slightly different to promotion. Promotion is a formal recognition. Recognition on a day-to-day basis is, thank you, you did a good job, or congratulations, team X, you managed to accomplish A, B, and C. So that sense of recognition and appreciation is a pretty important thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be formal, but it needs to be there. At least it has to be in place. And the fourth system, which if handled badly can create a lot of sour grapes, is remuneration, how people get paid Oh my goodness, if you want to press people's fairness buttons, do a clouded, shrouded remuneration system, and then attach remuneration to targets that are beyond people's grasp. That kind of stuff can cause a lot of sour grapes. So these are 4 of the main systems that I see, if not handled well, can cause a lot of dramas and sour grape issues. So that's the second thing you can do. And the third thing is map your capacity. So this is loss of performance, the threat to overwork, which caused people to go into silos, into ground splitter mode. So it's important that you help people get a sense of the whole picture. If I go back to the example at Outward Bound, when I was a young manager and I thought, you know, my area was the most important area because I was in charge of it, of course. What really helped me to get off my high horse, to be honest, was getting an understanding of how the whole organization worked together and how we could work together to make the whole organizational successful, not just my own patch. That takes a level of personal maturity to get there, because when we're first trying to achieve in our professional roles, we obviously want to have our department or our area do extremely well because it's a reflection of our own sense of self and own sense of self-esteem. So a smart leader needs to help encourage people to get beyond that, so that the success of the organization is part of their success, not just the success of their own team. It takes a lot of facilitation to do that, a lot of emotional intelligence as a leader to help your people get to that point. All right, so I have 7 steps for handling sour grapes. And I want to take you through a poll for that. I'm going to keep the slide here. Oh, no, I can do it. No, I can't do it this way. I'll launch the poll. And what happens is I'm going to read out the detail of each of these steps. The poll will be launched. And after I go through each one, you can tick off whether or not you are successful and accomplished and masterful at that step. So don't just go clicking all of these things all at once, because I have to read out the detail for you. Okay, so I've launched the poll. So let me run through each one of these one at a time. The first one is self-regulation. So this is you as the leader. And you can tick this if you manage to master all these things. I manage my own internal response. I notice when I get triggered and use breath to calm me down and develop coherence. I'll talk about that. Coherence is when you even out your breath and your heart rate variability goes into an even state. So you're just calm and composed. I pinpoint the underlying trigger for my emotional response every time in the moment. I locate the feeling in my body and ease the energy flow in the moment. I stay focused and listening to the other person, even while regulating my own emotions. So if you feel like you're masterful at that, you can click self-regulation. I'll go on to the next one, which is fairness. I listen one-on-one to each person's perspective of fairness. I ask first about what they think and why. I ask them what they would prefer instead. I ask them what opportunity there might be in the situation. I do not conclude the meeting until I am certain they have experienced some form of relief in the conversation. If you feel like you've mastered fairness, you can click that one. Status. I listen one-on-one to each person's concern about their contribution and being recognized and appreciated. I determine what status symbols are important to each person. Things like title, privileges, access, car park, desk space. I ask them how they feel their skills and expertise might be best put to use. Help them to see where the gaps might be in their expertise and how they might go about bridging those gaps. If you've mastered that step, you can tick that. Okay. Number 4 is performance. These are all in the cure category though. We'll move on to prevention in just a minute. So cure, sour grapes already, this is what you're doing to deal with them. Performance, I listen one-on-one about progress or lack thereof on key projects. I ask what the blockers are to performance. I work with them to resolve resourcing issues. I work with them to resolve skills gap issues. So if you feel masterful for that, you can tick that on the poll. Moving to prevention. These last 3 steps are about preventing sour grapes. Teaming is the next one. We have a team culture compass with a charter of agreed behaviors. We check in on this charter at least monthly. We call each other out for breaches when they occur. We make amends when breaches occur. We work on our team dynamic at least monthly by discussing difficult issues. We work on our team dynamics weekly by sharing personal wins. Number 6 is frameworks. We have clear roles and responsibilities. We have a documented process for resolving issues. We have a clear and documented process for decision making. We have clear and documented process for delegation. We actually use these processes. Okay, and the last one, maps. We map systems and dynamics. To break down siloed views, we have mind map the workflows between departments. We identify and resolve bottlenecks when we find them. We map individual team dynamics, inter-team dynamics, and executive team dynamics. Where there is friction, we facilitate resolutions and monitor the interactions. Where there is an absence of interactions, we facilitate experiences so teams get to know each other's work and each other. Okay. Feel free to click the ones you feel masterful in. See how we go. Okay. All right. It looks like we've got most people voted. We'll see how we go. End poll. I'm going to share the results with you. Look at that. So most people felt they're pretty good at fairness and performance. That's pretty interesting. And then self-regulation. That's really interesting. And then teaming, frameworks, and maps. So all the preventative measures are the ones that aren't necessarily the strongest in this cohort. Oh, fabulous. I will send you a copy of the 7 steps so you can have that in detail as well. Okay. If you have a comment or question about that, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or pop it into the chat box. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Yeah, I want to take you to what you can do next. So that was a big, long list of stuff that you can focus on. What's useful for you next is this. So let me just take you through that. First one is, if you have sour grapes, schedule one-on-ones with your sour grapes. Maybe that's too obvious, but maybe not. But sitting down and listening to people is definitely one way to get started in this process if you have sour grapes. This practice I'm going to teach you how to do right now. Practice coherent breathing before you meet with them. This is really important for self-regulation. So coherent breathing is something I learned about with Dr. Alan Watkins. I've interviewed him on my podcast. That episode's coming out soon. And his book, I think, is called Coherence. And he's got some amazing TED Talks. I'll put links to that as well for you, where he talks about this idea of coherent breathing. And what he's discovered is that when it comes to emotions, if we start with our physiology at the bottom, we have a better chance of regulating our emotions in a positive way. So coherent breathing is, he uses the acronym BREATHE, which is breathe regularly, evenly, and through the heart. So basically it means whatever cadence you want, whether it's 3 in, 3 out, 4 in, 6 out, doesn't matter, just keep the same cadence. You breathe smoothly in and smoothly out. Nasally, or probably nasally is better than mouth breathing. And you don't try and do big breaths, you just even and not staccato, just regularly and evenly. And you focus on the heart area. The reason the heart area is so important, it's actually, they found that while the brain has a lot of electrical activity going on, it's going on all over the place. The heart is a very concentrated energy focus because it goes da-dum, da-dum. So when we put our focus on our heart area, and we breathe evenly and regularly through that area, and we just imagine the breath coming in and out of our heart, what happens is that our heart rate variability goes even. So instead of going and being like stressed out, it just goes in a matter of moments. Just a couple of breaths would get you even. And what this actually does from a brain science point of view, it takes you out of an amygdala hijack, so out of fight and flight, and gets you back to point 0, where you can access your neocortex, your frontal lobe, where you can analyze issues, where you can learn things, you can listen effectively. So just doing that breathing technique gets you out of negativity into like point 0. From that place, you can start to look at issues and problems from a proactive, positive stance. So just doing that is really super important. That's your important tactic and strategy for today. And this third piece is really crucial, is the ask, don't tell. Find out about their thoughts on fairness, recognition, and performance. So those are 3 things in your back pocket that you can start to do right away. Here are some mistakes I see people running away with as soon as they go and try and deal with some of these 4 devils. Mostly I see this one, is that people don't prepare for their one-on-ones. And there's quite a lot of preparation to do. One of the first things I would do, apart from the self-regulation, is figuring out what dynamic is potentially at play for this person. Which fear of loss are they likely to be triggered by? And having a strategy to raise that with them in a non-threatening way. The other one is people don't manage their personal state. So they don't do any sort of breathing or mental and emotional prep work before they go into these difficult conversations. And often I see leaders sometimes getting defensive instead of staying curious, because if you've had a tough week, month, etc., and you're just tired of dealing with this stuff, it can be very easy to go defensive. And so we need to really be mindful of that. Number 4 is people don't follow up and close the feedback loop. I just did a training session last week with a group of young construction workers that are frontline managers. And that was a surprise to them. It's like how important it was to, once you deliver the feedback and have a conversation with that person, is that you check in and see how things went, have things improved, what are their issues, etc. And close that feedback loop is pretty important. The other thing is people don't address any of the preventative steps. So that was 5, 6, 7 on the 7 steps, which were how you're managing your team as a structure, your frameworks and your systems, and your map. How are you mapping dynamics and relationships and responsibilities? Key mistakes. I love this quote from Doug Baldwin. The greatest tragedy for any human being is going through their entire lives believing the only perspective that matters is their own. When I wrote People Stuff, my main objective in that book was to help people expand their perspective, to see themselves, the world, and others in a different light, in a varied different light. So the more that we can see of ourselves and the world and others, the more informed we can be, and the better interventions and decisions we can make for the better outcomes for all. So don't think that your perspective is the only one. Oh, my book is out. Love the book. And that's sort of it for today. So we've got our remaining, we have one more session, and that is, how do I get this one? Stop video, unpin video. Let's see if I can get this up. Here we go. One more webcast next week, and that is on carrots and sticks. This is about motivation and inspiration and how to manage that. So that's what's coming up in our final session next week. There will be follow-up notes and recording for you today. Before you head off, if there's anything that you would like clarified or anything that you'd like to share, now is the time. So if you want to put into the chat box something that you've appreciated or learned from today, that would be fantastic. What was something useful that you're taking away from today? That would be wonderful to share. Helps me understand what is resonating for people. And if you have any questions that you want to stay around for to have me answer, we can do that too. I've got a couple minutes before I take the chicken back to the vet. She's doing better, by the way. She had a big injury. All right, I'll just see what people are writing into the chat box. Okay. Breathing tip. Yes, breathing tip is really useful. Lurnia likes my People Stuff model. Different fears that drive people's reactions. Yeah, that's a really big one. 4 devils, new perspective on people. Yeah. One other thing about the model is that you might have one of the devils, and you might have a combination of factors that are triggering that devil. So it might not be a linear thing, like loss of power always leads to firebug. You might have a loss of control and autonomy, which leads to somebody being emotional. So those are a bit slippery. Those fears, they can show up and cause any one of the four devils, and in combination, you might have a number of them. Okay, fantastic. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much again for showing up on a Monday afternoon. I really appreciate it. And from all the different places around the country, it's wonderful to have you here and to be interested so much in helping people. Another thing you can do is put hands on your chest when you are talking to people through the webinars, because this actually gives you a boost of oxytocin, and we're all into being biochemical drug dealers. So as I say farewell for this evening, thank you so much. I'll see you next Monday.
Thanks, Zoe.